Good afternoon, everybody. I suppose it's evening for you, Professor Ram-Prasad, but it's such a pleasure for me to, I'm actually meeting you for the first time, albeit online. Um, so um, we actually, Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad has written 7 books, but I read just the end of last semester, Knowledge and Liberation in Classical Indian Thought. I'm not sure why it took me 20 years to read that. It was published in 2001, but it was absolutely, I've become a fan from reading that. Sometimes Indian philosophy is denied the status of philosophy because in the 19th century, 20th century, it was associated with mysticism and liberation. But this book shows the intense theorizing and intellectuality that has gone into the understanding and conceptualization of what moksha is in Indian philosophy. I think it's a magnificent contribution for those of us who are trying to bring Indian thought onto the table. So I personally wanted to thank you for that. And also, just anecdotally, I was reading this with a student of ours, and she was so inspired by that book. I know sometimes we don't get feedback from the universe. She was so inspired that she got into a PhD program, and from your book, she's now going to look at that sort of the eureka moment prior to liberation, that transformative moment, because obviously in the 4 schools you considered there's going to be a difference between, the world dissolving into Brahman, or, a sort of enlightened Buddhist pratitya samutpada, or, attaining some celestial form for the Mimamsas, or for the Vaishnavas, attaining a spiritual form. So what is that penultimate moment? And your book inspired her, and she's actually going to pursue that for a PhD topic. So that's just from just anecdotally from my side. So Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad is a fellow of the British Academy and distinguished professor of comparative philosophy and religion at Lancaster University. He's written over 50 papers and 7 books so far. And I'm looking forward, next on my list is going to be Advaita epistemology and metaphysics. And we'll see what discussya avidya, see what the Advaitins have to say, if they say anything coherent to Ramanuja's kasya avidya. So I'm hoping to find some answers in that. So 7 books, and one of which, The Philosophy of Being in 2 Gita Commentaries, won the Best Book Prize for the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. And I think Professor Ram-Prasad's most recent book is Human Being, Bodily Being, Phenomenology from Classical India. And I believe your Professor Ram-Prasad is currently developing a philosophical account of emotions from Sanskrit literature and aesthetic theory. So clearly this is a vast intellectual domain that's being covered here. So we're very honored, Professor Ram-Prasad, to tell us, we've always heard that good Hindus have to believe in God, and you're going to tell us why a good Hindu should not believe in God from the perspective of the Mimamsa school. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're honored to have you with us.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Ed. And thanks to Rutgers for inviting me. And I'm delighted that we have people from different places in the US and indeed other parts of the world being able to attend this. So some upsides of Zoom, I guess. So today I'm going to be talking about what I call here Hindu atheism. Although as we go through the talk, we will see that the theism that is being challenged by this system called the Mimamsa is fairly specific. And I hope that once we have actually gone through the arguments, we can also consider whether, in discussion, whether different conceptions of God might get around what Kumarila Bhatta argued. So what we find here is this intriguing position that the Mimamsa system, the system of exegesis, is so called because it is committed to the careful interpretation of the Hindu sacred texts, the Vedas. In particular, the Mimamsa school considers it imperative that we understand, or the particular practitioners who are qualified understand how the Vedas enjoin particular forms of ritual action. And it is these ritual actions that, performed in an interpretively creative and yet precise way, sustains the order of the cosmos, at the natural level, at the social level, and so on. So the Mimamsa system is, in that sense, extremely orthodox, or in fact orthoprax, because it goes back to the earliest texts, the most authoritative texts, according to them. And therefore, if at all we are going to say what is the oldest strand of the multifarious tradition we now call Hinduism, we would go back to the Vedas, even if it plays a very small role in today's Hindu life, or indeed if there are people who would consider themselves to be Hindus who nevertheless reject the authority of the Vedas. Despite all of those differences, if you're going to say what is the oldest extant Hindu texts, we would say they are the Vedas. And for a very long period of time, they exerted a particular kind of authority amongst the elites, and therefore through the elites in the life of the larger society. And yet we find that it's the exegetes of the Vedas who are saying that, in fact, we ought not to believe in a god, an Ishvara. Now, that term Ishvara comes to be used exactly like in other traditions, in the modern Christian philosophy of religion, for example. It comes to be used in a variety of different ways. But nevertheless, it is translatable as God. And we have this intriguing situation that the Mimamsa, or exegetical system, which is committed to the sacred nature of the Vedic texts, nevertheless reject God. They do so because they say that the Vedas are sacred in a particular way. Unlike all other texts, they are authorless. They do not have either a god or an omniscient person like the Buddha being another great opponent of the Mimamsas. Now, a typical example of a Hindu theistic philosophy of religion would be that expounded by another system, the Nyaya. The Nyaya thinkers did argue that a sacred text is the word of God, just like ordinary texts are composed by humans or by superhuman beings and so forth. The sacred texts are sacred precisely because their author is God. And that key commitment became, in a sense, part of much subsequent Hindu theism, even if the nature of that God were considered to be different. Nevertheless, the association between the sacred text and a sacred author was a view that the Nyaya thinkers expounded in the first millennium. And it is that view that perhaps one of the most important Mimamsa thinkers, Kumarila Bhatta, argued against in the 7th century text, the Shlokavartika, in which he develops the Mimamsa arguments. Now, as we look in greater detail at what the Nyaya God is like, we begin to see that perhaps here is an outline of an atheistic argument by Kumarila that is of applicability to other theistic systems outside pre-modern South Asia. Now, why did Kumarila, along with the previous Mimamsakas, argue that the text which is sacred is also authorless? He, along with his predecessors, held the view that the Vedas were a sort of linguistic revelation of the structure of reality to the seers who are mentioned in the Vedas themselves. by being uncontaminated by the creative expressiveness of an author, the sacred word is truly eternal. It is self-expressive of reality. So it is the structure of the universe made clear to the seers in terms of the actions that must be performed in it that constitutes the Vedas. Of course, the theist would say, well, yes, texts and the actions that they enjoin would be contaminated by the limitations, by the intentions, by the problematic nature of ordinary authors. But surely the sacred text, having been written, expressed by God, would not be so contaminated. So it is that consideration that Kumarila wants to argue against. His point was that only by denying authorship of the sacred text would the sacred text be ultimately authoritative. Because if its authority, if it's being able to enjoin us to proper ritual action, depended on an author, a divine author, then everything would turn not on the texts themselves, the text itself, but rather on the strength of the argument for who wrote it. What kind of an author is this, that we may so rely on the epistemological power of this author? So if you are going to have a sacred author, the argument turns away from the text and therefore lessens the power of the text. Now you can see why the exegetes were committed to the denial of a God, because they were exegetes of the sacred text. And for them, the text is sacred because it is the ultimate authority. And it could be ultimate only if it were self-standing. It was eternally authoritative, regardless of whether there was an author or not. Whereas to take a text to be sacred because it was written by a God means all our attention and our energies have to turn to demonstrating that there is a God of sufficient authority for the text to elicit proper ritual action from us. And of course, that is what a theist like a Nyaya philosopher would do. One thing to get out of the way is the Vedas, of course, mention all kinds of deities. Indra, the king of the gods, and Varuna, the god of rain, and Agni, the god of fire, and all kinds of gods, and more abstract gods like Vach, the goddess of speech, and so forth. So obviously Kumarila and the other Mimamsakas could not deny the mention of these gods. But that is a separate kind of argument, and the Mimamsakas take it out of the way by saying these are just humanized images of divine features, that it is simply a particular metaphorical way of speaking of the structures of the world in which we act and the nature of action in it, that we have these names of the gods. So those gods are not really important as far as the Mimamsakas are concerned, and as far as their opponents, the Nyaya philosophers, are concerned as well. It's really about the God of the texts. Now, if you're going to have a God whose creation, whose authored material, the sacred text, were to have this authority, then that God must be more than simply an author. That God must possess certain kinds of qualities. Omniscience, must be all-knowing, must be a creator, to have brought the world into existence, which is then revealed in the texts. And then having set up such a world, that God must be able to sustain it in systematic ways. So once you start saying the text is authoritative because of a God, you got to put in a lot of energy into saying who exactly that God is. So Kumarila looks at the features of such a putative God, a God who is a creator, a God who oversees the moral order of creation, and other such capacities that we will look at soon. And Kumarila's argument is none of that stacks up. So he gives a certain idea of what kind of a God would have the authority to have been the author of the sacred text, and then say that such a God is an incoherent idea, leaving therefore the text as authorless. So that's his overall structure. So I'm now going to turn to look at some of the arguments he gives, and I'll try and talk about it in a way that I hope has you thinking about how many of these ideas that he is attacking and the nature of his attacks sort of have a resonance with the philosophy of religion as it came into existence in the early modern Western period, when atheism as a systematic argument against the Christian God became such a formative influence in modernity. So my argument is, and I want to not go into the details of comparison, but to kind of leave the implications, and we can come back to it in discussion. What I want to do is to suggest that the arguments that we see here are actually quite powerful as arguments against the conception of God in many theological traditions. So I'm going to read some of these passages and then comment on them. And these are passages from the particular section of the Shloka Vartika, and I'm just extracting some verses from it. There's a very complex, larger context within which this argument is given, which we do not have the time to go into. So one set is what I call the questions of originations. It says, at a time when, this is verse 45 of this section, at a time when all this world did not exist, what could have been the condition of the universe? As for the creator God himself, this is translation that Ganganatha gives of the term Prajapati, which literally means the Lord of beings. It's a creator God. What would be that God's position and what his form? So it's a very general argument that gets to the heart of what a theist must say, because this is a God that exists before the world exists, and we should have clarity on such a God. I'm going to now skip a verse, and I'll come back to that later because it's a slightly different argument. In 47, 48, and 49, he goes on. Then again, in what manner do you believe the world to have had a beginning in time? That's to say, the point of creation. Since the creator God is held to be without a material body, how could he have any desire towards creation? In where does desire reside? And he goes on. And if he has a body, assuredly this body would not have been created by himself. Because why did he create a body for himself when he pre-existed? So he would have had to have brought the body into being. But then, since he could not do that, we would have to postulate another creator for God's body. If the creator body, God's body, be held to be eternal, because God is eternal, then we ask, since earth, etc., that is to say, the composition of the material world, would not yet have been produced, of what material would that body of God's be composed? So here we have two crucial questions. How can a bodiless God have such bodily states as desires? By what means can we explain anything recognizable as desire, which is a complex interplay that the Nyaya philosophers themselves, his opponents, would say requires the mental function of the mind, it requires the senses, it requires an interplay between all kinds of material functionalities. Without it, what do we mean by desire? So we can't help ourselves to the idea of desire, which we only know of through the bodily being of human beings or indeed of animals, and help ourselves to the intuition about desire being a certain kind of impellment towards certain kinds of actions, but strip away the very conditions under which desire happens, i.e. bodiliness. So you can't, it is incoherent to say we understand what a desire is through bodily functionality, but take away the body. Will what we have left any longer be called, can be called desire? So there is that kind of problem. If, on the other hand, to get around that, you have to say that God is bodied, and in this he anticipates some of the later arguments that Vedanta theologians would say that the world itself is God's body, that the personal God has, in fact, the body, for example, that we see in the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita. If you go into those kinds of commitments to a body, who could have created that body? Now, if God pre-existed body, why did then God, assuming God could have that desire to do so, make a body? If, on the other hand, God already had a body, where did that body come from? If you were going to say bodies are created, then there must have been another creator God, and then you have an infinite regress of creator gods creating the body of another God. So you cannot actually get around this. And if you're going to say in any case that the very understanding of the nature of the body comes out of our grasp of the material composition of the world, that would not have existed at some moment for God to have created it. So if it was eternal, then God is not a creator. As it turns out, in fact, one of the Vedanta schools called Dvaita, the school of dual Vedanta, says in fact that the world is eternal and God only oversees it. But at this point, Kumarila is attacking the idea of a creator God, a God who brings the material world into being, and says, where could that materiality have existed before God created it? So very quickly, in Kumarila's view, the notion of bodiliness collapses if you think of a creator God. In between, he has another argument too, which is also about origins, but is a slightly different aspect of it. That's why I've sort of extracted it and present it on its own. At that time, that is to say, at the point of creation, who would know him and explain his character to beings who were all, after all, created afterwards? Without perception, how can we determine the facts of existence? So Kumarila gives a classic sort of empiricist argument that really doesn't happen in the West until the sort of 18th century, which is that epistemologically, how could the nature of a God who existed, pre-existed creation, before creation, be known by those of us who came afterwards? And here again, he is aware that the Nyaya philosophers are going to say that of all the means of knowledge, the primary one is perception. So it's no good saying, I had a revelation, God came and said that he created the world. Because how do you know that the being that popped up in front of you, albeit of great powers, was the creator? There's a real problem here. Revelation, the self-declaration of God, will not do. An evil demon can pop up with such powers as to be indistinguishable to human capacities for understanding from any God that we might care to think of. Because at some point, our limited capacities will not be able to point out to the the difference between an extraordinarily powerful demon and something beyond it. Could be, Thanos from Avengers. For all we know, actually, if the power is used in a particular kind of way, the declaration of godliness that we would perceive could be a lie. The only way of knowing that something, say, has been done, even if it was, say, an ancient vase that was made by a potter, in Greek times, for example. Sure, at this point, we could look at that pot and say we did not perceive its creator. But we have a whole series of inferential sort of bridges before we get to other pots, other potters, perhaps even a chain of people who had observed this pot way back in time. So with all other creation, we know about its being created through the means of knowledge, whereas, that is to say, means of knowledge dependent on perception, which is the most important means. Whereas with a God that turns up and says that I created this world, but you were not there for it, how would we know? So we have not just the ontological question about the nature of the bodiliness of God. We not only have the volitional question of where desire resided, we also have an epistemological question. Even if there were such a God, how would you be able to establish that? So then we have another set of questions that I broadly call questions of theodicy and divine will, in particular questions of theodicy, the justification, the defense of why a God would create the imperfect world of suffering that we are in. So he goes on in verses 49 and 50. Also, in the first place, how is it that he, the God, should have a desire, assuming he has a desire, to create a world which is fraught with all sorts of troubles to living beings? For at that time, he would not have any guiding action in the shape of goodness or evil on the part of the living beings themselves. Nor can any creator create anything in the absence of means and instruments. So again, it's a double whammy. The last sentence is, of course, going back to the question of bodiliness. How is anything to be created when you don't have the means of creation, a divine body, and the instruments of creation, the material of creation? Without any of that, what is creation, as we say in the West, ex nihilo, out of nothing? But the first part is also quite interesting, which is to say, well, why is this world full of the troubles? And so, well, people get what they deserve. They're just deserts. There's a certain kind of moral order. Well, at the beginning of creation, everybody was equally without any moral division. So in a sense, we could say that only a narrative, say, like the tale of the fall and of the casting out from Eden, be a narrative response to the structural question here. How does suffering begin? And as we know, why at all, even if we have a tale of a fall from a perfect state of goodness, we still have a problem, as we will see in a little while, as to how the motivation to even do the good and bad according to which the world runs could have happened in the first place. So why did God have the desire to create a troubled world? It cannot be that the world is troubled because of the consequential actions of creatures, for there were none at creation. That's why we have to have all these elaborate narratives about how at all creatures brought it upon themselves. And then he considers potential answers. If you say that God creates the world out of pity, then we would say, well, in the absence of objects of pity or compassion, like people, no pity or compassion would be possible for him. And if he were compelled to create by pure compassion, he would create only happy beings. So we would not have a bad world if there was a God that had the capacity to only create happy beings. Now, structurally, if we are going to argue, and of course, in the context of classical India and ancient India, of course, the world is acknowledged to be a world of suffering. So if it were argued that without some pain, neither the creation or the continuation of the world would be possible, but we actually have a particular kind of structure to reality in which pain, and suffering are simply intrinsic. We reply, he says, when everything depends upon the mere will of the creator himself, what would be impossible for him? And moreover, if he were to depend upon law and agency, then this fact would deprive him of his supposed independence. So this is where we get the pinch point. The world should be good. Could it be that the world needs pain for it to be what it is? Well, why would an all-powerful God create that? If you were going to say it has something to do with the agency and the will of those creatures that God has brought about, then God is dependent upon the will of these creatures. So Kumarila is already arguing out the notions of theodicy and free will that we know becomes a huge matter in the subsequent millennium in Western philosophy of religion. So we have just gone through all of that. If God willed the world out of compassion, towards whom was the compassion directed when there were no creatures who could be the bearers of the objects of compassion? If the world now functions through pain and pleasure and good and bad, why did an omnipotent God create it that way? Because that seems to suggest either a malign intention or some kind of a limitation. And if there was a limitation because of the nature of things and by the agency of those who were created, then that God is not omnipotent. These kinds of teleologies, what brought the world about? Why did God bring about such a world? Carries on in this next set of arguments that Kumarila gives. What would be the end which such a God desired, which could not be gained without creating the world? So if you're going to say God creates the world in order for there to be human beings who can, or all kinds of sentient beings who can go back to realize God, to go back to God's presence in heaven or merge with God, whatever, why do all of that in the first place? For without some end purpose in view, suppose that were not the case, if God did not have such a kind of a telos built into it, then, well, even a fool does not act without wanting something. Even if the fool is wrong about what he does, messes up what he does, is not clear about the connection between what he does and what he wants, he still has a purpose. So if it was purposeless, if you were to act purposelessly, what would be the good of the intelligence, of the cognitive capacities, the sentience, the omniscience that God has? If the activity of the creator, he goes on, were due to a desire for mere amusement, so God is not doing it out of purpose, is not doing it out of will, but just as an act of freedom, of amusement, then that would go against his being eternally contented. If you're contented, you do not want entertainment. If you want entertainment and you created the world for that kind of reason, then that God is not completely self-satisfied in the first place. So there is something limited about God, a need for contentment. And we know the pathway where that path leads, the need for contentment leads to suffering, and you don't want a God who is capable of suffering. Furthermore, he goes on, the great amount of work required for creation would be a source of infinite trouble to this God. I mean, that much work for entertainment? That again seems not even the action of a fool. Finally, also his desire to dissolve the world too would hardly be explicable. So if you're going to say in the Hindu system of things that there are eternal cycles of existence, he starts in 54 to say, in verse 54, to say, why at all would the world come in to existence? And then 57, he says, why at all would it dissolve? So the entire cycle of creation and dissolution looks completely unmotivated. And if not, the motivation points to a God who is less than a God. So we've just been through those arguments. Then he turns to something that, again, goes back to that epistemological problem he keeps having. How do you know, even if we saw a being that said it was God, that it was God? And this is, I think, perhaps one of the sort of rare, perhaps unique argument in cross-culturally about the arguments against the existence of God. Above all, such a creator could never be known by anybody. Even if we are known in his form, in Revelation, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, the fact of this being the creator could never be known. For at the start of time, what could the living beings only now beginning to be created understand? So he repeats that earlier point. They could not understand where from they had been born, nor could they know the state of the world before creation, or the fact of the creator God being the creator. Nor could the idea that they could derive from his own assertion that he was the creator be trustworthy, because even though he may not have created the world, he might speak of having done so in order to show off his supposed power. We've already encountered this. In the same manner, the sacred text that supposedly arose from him would only be doubtful, and hence could not be admitted as a sure proof of his existence and creative power. So what is the relationship then between God and the text? Kumarila is pointing out to a circularity in any attempt to prove the existence of God through the text. You can't know anything about a creator God. If you depend on God to know that the sacred text is true, why do you follow a text? Why does it become sacred? Oh, because God revealed it. Well, how do you know you can depend upon the being that claims to be God? For the only way of knowing you can depend upon God is, in the end, the sacred text. And if God were to reveal himself, that would not prove that he created the world, for who could establish that the being that revealed itself was also the creator God? So that circularity, that after all, theists go back to their commitment to God through the text. But the text has that authority only because it was created by God. And therefore, God and text are interdependent. And if you needed then to know that there was a God, the text would not give it to you, because the text would come only if there were a God whose existence could be proven independently of the text. And the claim by any being to be God could not structurally, however powerful that God is, could not structurally change the fact that those who are gaining that revelation will never know that this is a God, because they were not there by definition at the time of creation. So such a God could never be proven. Then we have an argument which, and I think that argument in particular is perhaps unique to Kumarila. But of course, again, it has a bearing on any theological system that that depends upon the intimate connection between a sacred text and the God who is the author of it. But now we have another set of questions, a question of free will, which are much more sort of almost a standard kind of questions that we introduce in first year Western philosophy of religion to students. If the desire of God be held as the motive force for creation, then the desire in itself would be the efficient cause of the creation of beings. And if creation were dependent upon God's wish, it would be useless to assume the agency of beings acting towards good and bad. Also, it is not possible for God's desire to be produced without any cause. If there were any such cause, then that would be the cause of the world. So what Kumarila is arguing here is that the free will of the one, God, implies the lack of free will in the other, the human being. So if God were omnipotent, then how can there be free will? And if free will were built into the creatures like human beings, then there was a limitation to God's omnipotence. And on the other hand, if you're going to say, well, God creates in such a way as to contain within God's power the free will of creatures such as human beings, so that agency is part of how they are constructed. Therefore, God has that power. Then why did God create the world of suffering in the first place? So we're back to the question of theodicy. So this very fine point at which you want to allow the God to give agency in such a way as to allow that agency to become the driver for suffering. Kumarila basically says there is no such point at which you can make that maneuver. Once you allow for the devolution of agency into these creatures who then bring, as it were, suffering upon themselves, then you're back to asking what is the nature of a God that would allow that. If, on the other hand, you're going to say that God, in fact, has the power to do such things, then that God can only be malign to allow such a thing to happen. So it is illusory, one might say, from Kumarila's point of view, to allow that place where human agency is consistent with an omnipotent God, such that it also becomes the explanatory power for suffering in this world. Can't happen. Either God has the power or God doesn't have the power. If God doesn't have the power, then God is not God. If God has the power, then God is evil for allowing such a world to happen. He's got another question of the omnipotence of God. With regard to a person, the divine person who is himself utterly pure, the transformations of the world could not be impure, such as we see the world is. Dharma, righteousness, this right order, that for the Mimamsaka is what is taught in action, what is enjoined in action in the text. Dharma, etc., would be absolutely under his power. So it is not right that there should be pain in this world. So he's now going back to really driving home this point about theodicy. And if outcomes in the world were to be regulated instead by dharma, which is what the Mimamsaka believes, your sticking to actions determine how what you get as a return, as a consequence of your action. If they were to be regulated by dharma, etc., then we would have to accept something else than God's desire is ultimately causative. And you might as well do so. So for the Mimamsaka, it is perfectly consistent. If the text were authorless, if it was a revelation of the self-revelation of the structures of proper conduct in this world, then dharma is the origin of what goes right and what goes wrong, and how human beings' agency determines what goes right or what goes wrong with them. So it's a much more elegant explanation to take this back to the text. But if you have a God you're back to all of those questions of theodicy. Sorry. So the necessary relationship between the creator and creation again raises the choice between theodicy and ultimacy, which is what we've been looking at. Why would an omnipotent God create a world of suffering? And if something else determined the fact of God, suffering, God would not be truly God. So this is what Kumarila keeps going back and hammering on. So I think I should how do I get? I'm now trying to exit this screen. There you are. Okay, are we able to see me?
Yes, yeah, we can see you.
Thanks very much. So in a way, I want people to be thinking about the arguments themselves, many of which are quite remarkably prescient in light of how they come to be independently developed and argued from the 17th and 18th century onwards in a Christian context in Europe, some of which do draw on earlier arguments by Buddhists, who were also, of course, atheists. And some are deeply embedded in the specificities of that classical Sanskritic view of the world. And each of them deserves, I think, to be followed through in its own way. But what I wanted to ask really was what the consequences of Kumarila's arguments were. In the centuries after him, the Nyaya philosophers did go on to spend a lot more time looking at what their conception of God was. In the 10th century, Udayana, for example, writes the Nyaya Kusumanjali, in which he develops an entire account of the Nyaya theory of God. But remarkably, there are very few arguments he gives which directly try and block these arguments of Kumarila's. One argument that gains a little bit of traction is he says we have to consider God's body not in terms of the materiality of the world, but of a different eternal magnitude that is not comparable to all other beings. So, of course, that looks rather ad hoc, because you start then saying that God's desire is again different from how we understand desire. God's body is different from how we understand the body. And it, to some extent, again, anticipates by a couple of centuries, perhaps, how Aquinas tries to create two different orders of understanding about the nature of the very words that we use in the human realm and how we use them in the context of God. But much of the Nyaya construction after Kumarila does not try and block these specific questions about theodicy, for example, about the nature of human agency. It simply goes back to saying structurally, there is a positive argument to give that the world as it functions cannot be made explicable without a commitment to a God. But that is not, in a way, a proper response to Kumarila, I think. The Kumarila's intuition here is that so long as you're talking about why you need a God, you might have a whole series of plausible ways of taking human expectations in the direction of this commitment. So it's easy, it's relatively easy to build up an account of why we need God. It's much more difficult to respond to the atheists' arguments as to why you cannot have a God. why you not only do not need a God, but why you cannot have a God. That, I think, has always been the experience, even in the sort of discussions of atheism in the Christian context in early modern Europe. You can build an account of God. It's much more difficult to block the accounts against God. All you have is the difference between whether you're committed to God or not. And although, again, we need an entirely different sort of talk and different direction in which to go, we do find this happening in the 11th and 12th century in the thinking of the great Vedanta thinker Ramanuja. Ramanuja, in effect, says that that commitment to God, why we are drawn to the narrative of God, is not, in fact, a matter for what the traditional Indian philosopher would call the pramanas, that is to say, the means of validating our experience in order to generate knowledge. In other words, it's not a matter of knowing and proving. Kumarala's arguments are always against proofs for the existence of God. And Ramanuja says, actually, the commitment to God is not a matter of proof. Of course, we arrive at that position in Western thought only with Kant, who makes the difference between belief and faith. And in that sense, Ramanuja is consciously seeking to locate himself against Kumarila. At a different point in the text, when he's criticizing the Buddhists, Kumarila calls himself, he says, I'm ashraddhadana. I am a faithless man. What he means by that is I'm not committed, I'm not dedicated. I only go according to where my reasoning takes me. And my reasoning, of course, takes me to an orthodox text. Ramanuja, in a sense, flips it around and says, well, that's why there is a problem with the Mimamsaka arguments. Because, of course, the Vedanta thinkers want to be committed to the sacred nature of the text. They want to help themselves to the interpretation of the ritual actions in the text that the Mimamsa philosophers give. But they have to get around the Mimamsa rejection of God. So Ramanuja's argument effectively is, yes, in the end, after all the performance of the ritual actions of the Vedas, what you are left with is faith, faith in Narayana or Vishnu, according to the one true God, according to Ramanuja. So I think that really by the 12th century, we have come to the stalemate that we encounter really only in modern atheism and Western thought, which is that the arguments against God are seen as unanswerable. And yet, the conditioning of human existence, the way in which every level of how so many human beings live makes sense only through a God, is to be explained by the question, the matter of faith. And I would guess that if we went back to Kumarila with that move of saying the God that we are committed to is a God of faith, he's going to shrug his shoulders and says, well, I don't have that faith. And I think that sort of abyss that stands between the one who is faithful and the one who is faithless has never really been bridged. And I would go so far as to suggest that in these coruscating few verses, Kumarila really sketches out the argument for why that bridge can never be built. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for this very rich presentation. So we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So what we're going to do is feel free to raise your hand, use the raise hand function. It's in the reaction icon at the bottom of the of Zoom. or you can put your name or your question in the chat room, so we can do it that way. So I'm going to start with Edwin.
Could I ask that one of you, either Tao, Edwin, could you read out the question for me, because I struggle with my glasses.
I'm going to speak it. Can you hear me, Ram? You can hear. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I have a question that's long been tormenting me, or I've been puzzled by. So the presupposition that Kumarila shares with Nyaya and also with Aristotle, that gets absorbed then into Aquinas, is that were God to have a body, it would be a material body. And that just seems to be taken a priori. All bodies that we know in our experience, right, are material, and therefore were God to have a body, it would be a material body. There's never the idea, the possibility that God might have some other kind of body. You mentioned Udayana, I'm not familiar with that. But my question is, I understand Ramanuja rejects, even critiques fellow Ishvaravadins, the fellow theists in Nyaya, because they're trying to use inference in defense of God. But I'm puzzled as to why Ramanuja and Madhva, and you see the same thing in the Gaudiya in the 16th century Krishna traditions, why do they not at some point mount an argument or make some sort of a case that God's body is not a material body, but Satchidananda Vigraha, it is a spiritual body, that God is eternal, Ramanuja would say, right, exists for all eternity in Vaikuntha, in a divine realm, a Brahman realm. But why do we not see, these are stated theologically, but why don't we see that kind of reworked into a philosophical argument, at least questioning the premise that were God to have a body, it could only be a material body? Why did we not see that arise in Indian, from the Vaishnava traditions and possibly even Shaiva Siddhanta? Well,
because I think the argument would be that you might have an account of the immaterial body, the Satchidananda and the Swarupa and so on, the form, so far. Two things there. One is, of course, would we be right in thinking of the concept of the body, where you have, for example, Satchidananda and the Swarupa, the own form, the intrinsic form of being existence and bliss? It's not necessarily clear that that would constitute what we might think of as a deha or a sharira, what would, lexically be stable as the notion of a body. And the reason why that becomes important is because the concept of the body as a deha or a sharira is tied to materiality, because it is about the creation of the material world. So it would still remain mysterious as to what the conceptualization of an immaterial body, as it were, would do to help in the mystery of the transition from there being God to there being a material world. So the argument about the materiality of the body is because when we talk about creativity, we need the relationship between a material creator and, the materials and the actions and desires and the instruments, and what is created. But if what we are saying here is that God, who is not part of, who doesn't have the material world, nevertheless brings it about, then calling that capacity to bring it about some kind of a non-material body doesn't get us very far, because that transition from there being no world of materiality to there being a world is that transition point, which he is saying is inexplicable, to then postulate a mysterious capacity to materialize from what we want to talk of as a body, but which doesn't have any of the capacities for materiality, is an empty hypothesis. So I think that the Vaishnava notion of this form of the divine that isn't material is not meant to respond to that particular problem of material creation. It is rather to talk about all the other notions about manifestation, about, what is seen and what is not seen, and what is eternal and so forth.
Okay. And does anyone just come back at Mimamsa and say, well, what reason do you give then for the existence of the world? If you have an eternal world with an eternal Veda, well, what reason do you give for that status quo? Does anyone just turn around and just ask that? Because I realize that's not addressing the arguments they're raising.
Yeah, but there is if the world is eternal, the Buddhists say that is too. It's anadi.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
And Madhva Vedanta says also the world is eternal.
Right.
Then there is no whyness to the world. The world simply is. There might be a fundamental question of why is there anything rather than nothing, which we ask now. But that is not, there's no whyness to the world, as it were.
Yeah. Thank you, Ram. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, next, Karsten. No, you're muted, so you need to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, okay. Even though I know you wanted us to focus on the arguments, I'm really interested in this question of why the Vedas would be sacred, not independently of whether there's a God or not. That is maybe what is demonstrated is that God doesn't help us in giving a sacredness to the Vedas. But then, does anything help us give a sacredness to the Vedas? That's my most interesting, what I'm most interested in. But I do have a thought about desire. Why would it be necessary for desire to depend on materiality? I mean, it's true that we only know desire because we're in beings like ourselves, because we're embodied, and I guess we can extrapolate to animals. But phenomenologically, we know desire without necessarily attaching it to any bodily function. Why couldn't we simply extrapolate from that and ask, well, maybe God has that sense of desire, it's just not attached to a body. In fact, we don't really know the connection between the desires that we feel and the neurological structure. Maybe, there's, neuroscience suggests that there's such a connection, but all it really establishes is correlation.
Okay, so on the first question, I think it is interesting because we then have to start exploring how we understand the idea of the sacred and what kind of a dimension it is. I think Kumarala's commitment would really be only to the authoritativeness of the text in a way that nothing else has this authority. And the authoritativeness of the text comes from its from a commitment to the Veda, at least as far as the Veda, the Hindu thinkers like the Nyaya philosophers who are committed to the Vedas, for them, the Vedas are authoritative because ultimately they lay out the structures of ritual action, what we must do in order to sustain the cosmos. Now, that's something that his Hindu opponents will not deny. And Kumarala never mentions anything about the Vedas when he's arguing with the Buddhists, because there he just completely concentrates on the notion of how any human being could be omniscient. So his argument there is simply to knock the claims of the Buddha being omniscient and therefore his words being authoritative off. He never says what the Vedas do in this regard. Just turning to the Nyaya philosophers and their commitments, they don't disagree that the Vedas are at least authoritative because they give the eternal codes of action to hold up the world, and no Orthodox Hindu would deny that.
So a question here, even though that wasn't a living question for them, we can look at this and say, well, the idea that these ritual actions sustain the cosmos is purely a matter of faith. It's not a matter of knowledge.
That's right. Yeah, I think he would say that because from our perspective, we would say if you follow Kumarila through, all notions of sacred, all notions of the religious dimension of life collapses.
Mhm.
He could obviously do this only by himself. Yes, he's a more powerful atheist than he, in his own context, he would recognize. Absolutely. So on to the second question. I think that there are maybe a couple of different things going on with the question of desire. One would be that without having any knowledge of the microstructures of the brain and so forth, the Nyaya philosophers too, and the Mimamsakas, agree with them on this, are to some extent materialist about such things as desire, because for them, you need some kind of functioning. They put a lot of weight on the notion of the manas. The manas is, the mind as a kind of a subtle internal organ. And there's a relationship, all kinds of different accounts are given between the presence of consciousness, that perspectival presence, and the functionality of the mind that then relates through a rather mechanistic way with the other kinds of, the more recognizable things of the body in order for desire to even occur. Otherwise, desire is not a feature of consciousness itself. It needs the articulation through particular kinds of states, which are states of the mind, and the mind is, as it were, on the side of the material. So that's one kind of thing about how mysterious would it be to have something like will and desire, which are not, in fact, explicable through at least some kind of a pre-scientific or proto-scientific location in this kind of manas. And in that sense, they are no worse off than thinking there are, microtubules in the synapses which explain it, right? It's somewhere at that point to have a sense that it is part of the constitution of the human being.
So just to ask, so really the answer is it's simply a part of their metaphysics.
Yes, it is simply part, just to say, well, then the question comes, I was coming to the next part. If you're going to say, I can nevertheless give you a definition of desire whose existence and functioning makes no reference at all to anything to do with the nature of our sort of bodily being. What even would it mean? So now you could say the phenomenology of the presence of desire does not, in its own definition, include a requirement that it be part of a material physics, metaphysics. Okay, then so what? You would still have the problem that we cannot explain how desire would function as desire, apart from simply being present without there being this kind of material body. So we're back to that first question anyway.
That strikes me as a stronger point than just that it's part of their metaphysics.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is the second,
yeah,
the second part, as it were, makes sense of why the first part.
Thank you. This is fascinating, really fascinating. Have you written on this? Is there anything we can read
I was literally trying to think my way through it as you were asking this really insightful question. And I do think that, yeah, there's very little work. I don't know, Ed might know more about this. I don't think there's anything very systematic about the nature of Icha, wish, or desire, and Sankalpa, Kalpana as will. There are different places, but there's no single kind of unifying study of it across different systems.
Have you written these? Have you expanded these arguments in any way in writing?
I've never written on Kumarila's argument about God. I've written about the nature of the self and how the divide between the metaphysics of the self and all that we think of as the mind in the West interchangeably actually is much more strictly drawn in the Indian material. So a lot of the things that right through to Descartes set up this notion of the mind-body difference doesn't happen in the classical Indian systems across Hindu and Buddhist systems, because the mind is really seen in simply a proto-scientific way as part of what we would think of as body. So it really puts a lot of pressure on what we think of as body by looking at these classical pre-modern Indian materials.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. This is by Shiravan. So the question is, after the sophistry of the various schools, does it not finally boil down to one's perception and face, and therefore any external validation is not only not required, but also irrelevant?
Yeah, well, absolutely. If you are simply going to say my faith makes anything else you say irrelevant, then, well, that's the beginning of the complete breakdown of any communication between human beings. You know, that's basically the end of it, because my faith it's exactly what drives me to do any kind of thing. And I'll say that I don't need any validation to blow up this world. So I think we have to be very careful before we go down. People who say that might think of themselves as, I don't need you to tell me how inconvenient and inconsistent my ideas are. I'm perfectly happy with them. But if you're perfectly happy with them includes having to, I don't know, as I said, you know, blow up cities or kill people or whatever, then we are down a very, very dangerous path. So at least we have to hold ourselves up to the communicative restrictions of being fellow human beings.
Thank you. Dean, next.
So this is fascinating. I'm learning all sorts of things about thinkers I knew nothing about. So thanks very much for that. The complaints about the problem of evil and the difficulty of theodicy and so on, that's quite familiar terrain from the point of view of Christian theology, Jewish theology, and so on. The thing that was most, sort of brand new, nothing I'd ever thought about before, was the business about the sacred text not being sort of sufficiently autonomous if there was a God.
Between the text and
yes, right. That something had never, nothing like that has entered my mind. The only thing close to it that I could think of is theological views about the nature of the Quran as an eternal, uncreated attribute of God, essentially. And I wondered if any idea remotely like that would have been available, an attitude like that would sort of, fuse the two in a way so that this problem wouldn't arise.
Yeah, okay, so two things. Yeah, I don't think they were available to Kumarila, because what we might think of as theology in Western terms really doesn't start until a few centuries after him. Until then, we have what we might think of as philosophy of religion, to use that rough and ready distinction. It's really, in the north with somebody called Abhinavagupta in Kashmir, but especially with Ramanuja, which I would say so because I'm born in this tradition. But Ramanuja really wants to find a way in which the commitment to the text that he considers sacred, not necessarily always the Veda, but some of the specific Vaishnava texts, do try and not make the text reliant on the proof of the existence of God. So it's part of his larger move to say that it is a matter of faith and how it's worked out in the lives of human beings. So it's actually the the moral performance of the devotion to the God of the text that establishes the text as the way according to which we must live in this life. So it's actually by witness, in a way, he introduces that. But actually the big step is really because of Islam. One might say that it is articulated most clearly in the South Asian context in Sikhism, of course, where the text is itself, as you say, an intrinsic feature of God. But that's also because the Sikhs were deliberately bringing together, especially Vaishnava and Islamic thought. So in that sense, Kumarila had nobody who would be thinking of the text in this sort of non-epistemological way.
Thank you. Edwin has another question.
You're still muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
If that's okay, I don't want to sort of hog, if anyone else has a question.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
I'll ask. Well, actually, two questions. The first is a bit more trivial. So Kumarila then, okay, he says the devas, the little gods are just dative case endings. They're metaphoric. They're not real. And okay, and the Upanishads, well, okay, all that talk about Atman is just because something has to go to the celestial realm, so therefore we have an Atman. But I mean, he must be rejecting the Janmadhyasya Yataha of Vedanta. But apart from that, he must be rejecting the mass of the Smriti. He must be rejecting all of the Purana, or somehow dismissing them in some sort of way. 400,000 verses, the Itihasa, 100,000. So that's just my one question. But the other question, if I may, and I know you said that the Nyaya theists don't respond to his arguments, but Nyaya, Ishvara is an Atman and has the qualities, Icha, has desire as a fundamental quality. And remember, the mind in Nyaya is not like Sankhya, where the comments you were making before, there's, the Sankhya, the materiality of the mind applies a little less to Nyaya and Mimamsa, because the mind there has just whizzing around, has much less of a function than it does in Sankhya. The qualities of desire and aversion are qualities of the Atman. So how does Nyaya, whose Ishvara has desire as a quality, how do they account for, or do they not, for creation? How does, not the reason why the why of creation, but how does the desire of Ishvara transform into the materiality of creation? Does Nyaya have anything to say about that? So two different.
Yeah, so I think my understanding is, I have to read, I read the Nyaya Kusumanjali for other things a long time ago, not in relation specifically to how Udayana might be seen as responding to Kumarila. But the basic idea there is that there is a sui generis bodiliness to Ishvara, including, therefore, the expression of Icha in Ishvara's Atman. So you basically have two different ways of looking at body. So there is a complicated causal account as to how this body might become, in a way, able to be creative of the other kinds of bodies, that is to say, the material world. So in a sense, again, goes back to the kind of answer I was giving to Carsten. I think the Nyaya philosophers might, to some extent, deflect it by saying, oh, but God's got a different body. Which is why Ramanuja goes full extreme and say, actually, the world is God's body. And there is then that you get into a whole other set of ideas that I don't think we have the time to go
Nyaya
into.
use the language of body at all?
Yes. So Udayana says that God's body is a different kind of body than the world and all that God created.
I mean, when Ramanuja is talking about the world as body, he's talking as in terms of metaphysics, but then God also has a body, sui generis body. But anyway, that's another thing, and you've addressed that before.
Yeah, that's another problem. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And in terms of the Smriti, then Kumarila pretty much must jettison the whole.
Okay, so he's got
Yeah.
a lot to say in the Tantravartika on this, the other, large text he has, 3 texts. And he basically interprets all the actions. He gives really intricate examples from the Mahabharata and so on. So, everything there in terms of exemplification of chodhana, of the injunctions of ritual. So he simply treats them as, Krishna, for example, becomes the exemplar of Vedic righteousness, you might say. So he just treats all of that as narrative devices, exactly as with the gods in the Vedas. All the Puranas, all the Itihasa, all of that get reworked as exemplifying the principles of proper action that are enjoined by the Vedas. So that becomes his entire undertaking in the Tantravartika, really, to map these examples. In fact, he doesn't systematically say these stories should be interpreted in this way. He presents his undertaking as explaining how particular kinds of rituals have purposes, and he uses these examples from the Smriti, all these other sources, as exemplifying those ritual injunctions.
Okay, so are you good, Edwin?
Yeah. So he basically they're human constructions. He would agree with the present day mythologists and say they're all just human constructions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ram.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Karsten?
As long as there's nobody else. Okay, I should mention, I've been interested for a while in how one can think of the spiritual dimension within an atheistic perspective. And Buddhism is a very good example of this for various reasons. On the other side, I think Nietzsche is also an interesting example of this. But it was fascinating to me that one could find in Hinduism something of this sort. But I wonder now what the spiritual dimension would be there. So for example, is there still the Atman? Is the Atman still the Brahman in any sense of the term?
No, well, there is an Atman. The Atman is most definitely not Brahman for the Mimamsakas.
No sense of it.
So, but the thing is, oddly enough, the history of Mimamsa shows that Kumarila's arguments could not resist the irresistible tides of Hindu spirituality, because really by the time the Vedanta thinkers, including people like Ramanuja, but also his later, his 13th century successor, Vedanta Deshika, have systematically wholesale imported the epistemology and the ritual structures of Mimamsa into their own Vedantic metaphysics and theology. The Mimamsa commentators themselves from the 14th, 15th century, in effect, become theists. They start their texts with invocations to Narayana, to God, as is Vishnu. So what has really happened is that there's a sort of a corralling of the uncomfortable anti-spiritual aspects of Kumarila. So I think the answer, therefore, is that if you're going to strictly follow Kumarila through, you're not going to get an atheist spirituality. For that, you have to look in other places with a further question about, well, what would theism mean? For example, in Advaita Vedanta, that is so well known in the West, relatively speaking, is that a theism in any sense? It's certainly some kind of a spiritual discipline, but again, whether it should be understood in theistic terms or not, itself becomes part of a 1,000-year-old, 1,200-year-old dispute. So I think we should put pressure on the spiritual as much as on the atheistic, or rather on the atheistic as much as on the spiritual when we're looking at these other Indian systems.
So just to follow this, so there still is an Atman. What does the Atman mean with this in this
Okay,
perspective.
so the Atman is, I have written on that one. The Atman is very close to what in Western thought we might think of as a soul, because it has a personal identity.
Mhm.
It is the non-material transmigratory entity which carries with it the karmic commitments of the adherence to ritual. And in the book that Ed was talking about, I try and figure out what for the Mimamsakas liberation or moksha could possibly mean. And it's a rather minimalistic definition of ending the transmigratory pattern of existence.
But
so
then
all the soul Atman does is to behave from one life to another such as to stop accruing the consequences of its action, therefore, so that it does not continue to experience suffering.
But then the Atman is not a universal soul in any sense.
No, absolutely not. But the Atman is not a universal for pretty much all the systems of thought, except for 2 or 3. So it's actually much more common to use the Atman in a highly individualistic way, including with the Nyaya philosophers.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much. We want to thank Ram for this incredible presentation and for this very right-ranging discussion, and for all of you for contributing to the discussion and for attendance. Thank you, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ram.
Thank you.